Hello everyone and welcome back to the Cyclocross Social Podcast. Today it's another weird day to have a cyclocross race, but nevertheless we will be making a podcast about the third round of the Superprestige in Niel, and I am joined by Issam.
Hey everybody.
And Twan.
Hello.
Today it was a national day off in Belgium as they celebrated the end of the First World War, and plenty of people thought that was a good opportunity to go and watch a cyclocross race, and that is why there's always this race in Niel together with the market that they have in the town. There were plenty of spectators, which was really good to see, and the race was a very eventful one. Issam, tell us about it.
Yeah, indeed, the European champion Lars van der Haar had a lot of interest in going at the front in the beginning of the race. We actually quite early in the race saw already that there were four guys that were going to contend for victory, who were Van der Haar, Hermans, Aerts and Iserbyt. One guy that missed that group was Sweeck. He was in a long pursuit, but in the end was just not able to get there. And obviously the problems that he had, a mechanical failure with his gear, didn't really help. And that was his race kind of over. He will only manage to finish 7th. But then the four ahead, they had a very strong battle. It was up and down, a lot of mistakes made. Hermans had a gap, but then made the mistake. Toon and Van der Haar were actually able to get away from Iserbyt and Hermans, but they also managed to get stuck in the sand, and then everybody was able to come back again. Van der Haar had a very strong moment as well, but then eventually also faded a little bit. Then, in the penultimate lap, Iserbyt gets a gap, and that gap, he will not let it go towards Van der Haar and Hermans. They will not be able to come back. But there was only one guy after the tumble to get actually back in the wheel of Iserbyt, and that was Toon in the last lap. But that was only due to a puncture in the last lap of Iserbyt. And then they were going to battle out because there was like around 3 to 4 seconds between the two into the sand section. Poor sand section for both, but the Iserbyt sand section was a little bit better than Aerts, and then they have to sprint. Iserbyt starts ahead in the sprint, comes a little bit off his line, but is able to, in the end, win the race in Niel, the third race of the Superprestige, the Jahrmarktcross in Niel, and second place for Toon Aerts, and a third place, rounding off the top 3, Quentin Herrmonds.
I mean, there was so much happening in this race, we definitely can't discuss everything. I think key here was making as little mistakes as possible, and certainly if you made a mistake, like it was better to do it in the earlier phase of the race, like we saw with Iserbyt. He made some mistakes in the beginning of the race, whilst we saw with Hermans and Aerts that they made mistakes towards the end of the race, and that was pretty costly, but nobody had a flawless race. I mean, we can briefly talk about the parcours. I mean, you can say what you want about it. There were some interesting features, to say the least, but I mean, it was a very tricky parcours overall, in my opinion. I didn't like everything, but it was certainly a tricky parcours, which led to a lot of mistakes and provided us with an interesting race.
Yeah, in my opinion, I think this parcours was pretty good. Like you said, there were some sections that I didn't really like. There were some corners which were a bit off camber and a bit unsafe in my opinion, but overall it was a nice parcours. It had all the elements, especially the part where you had the mud, the long section where you had to run, and then you can choose to either go on your bike and do the next section in the mud, or do it a little bit on the bike and then go off your bike and start running. But I think overall it had all the elements. It's a very fast parcours, and that's what we saw. Like, if you had a gap of 3-4 seconds, you could lose it all in one section because of a mistake, and mistakes were definitely made from everybody. I think we saw everybody make a mistake, but I guess in the end, the one that made the least amount of mistakes and maybe was the strongest won the race.
Yeah, I think overall the parcours was a bit too much for my opinion. It was obstacle after obstacle after obstacle, made it hard to memorize, but I mean, this new feature, the moguls, it was weird. I don't really think that was the best thing or the safest thing, but hey, they gave it a try. I don't know if it will be there next year. I don't hope it will be there. In my opinion, they can replace it with something else or leave it out. The parcours is difficult enough. It doesn't need all these artificial difficulties and obstacles that they created here. But about Iserbyt, did he make the least mistakes? Probably. I think he was the strongest. I already thought in the beginning of the race, you saw this group with Hermans, Van der Haar, Aerts and Iserbyt, and Iserbyt was waiting, he was hiding, he was pretending to not be good enough. But when Aerts opened the gap, then you saw that Iserbyt reacted and closed the gap pretty quickly, so that already gave me the feeling that Iserbyt was good enough to challenge, not that he would be dropped like on the European Championships. And then in the end, he did open a serious gap, especially by being able to ride up that very steep climb in the penultimate lap. I think without that puncture in the last lap, he would have won comfortably. But nevertheless, we had an entertaining race. Twan, what is your thought on that?
It was a very testing parkour, and it made for some very good racing where people were able to get back on quite a few times, which made it a really tight race, and it was really enjoyable to watch. And like you said, the moment he rides up that really steep bank in the penultimate lap, it's really a moment that I was like, oh god, he has something left, and it will be scary for the other guys to actually keep in contention. And he was just riding a very strong race. Very unfortunate for him that he had the flat tire and that he had to take it in a sprint, which I think there can be something said about that as well.
Yeah, but before we come to that sprint, I think the key moment of the race was when Iserbyt opened the gap, because Aerts made a mistake. You had this downhill after the first climb after the start. And you had this downhill, and then it went slightly uphill in very thick mud. This is probably the deepest mud I've seen in, I think, ever since I started watching cyclocross. You saw half legs disappear in the mud, and that was very tricky if you came in on fast speed and then needed to hop off. You could easily crash, and Aerts did, and Van der Haar, who was behind, also followed him. And then Iserbyt had the serious gap, but I think that Iserbyt and Aerts were really closely matched. I think Aerts was maybe the strongest in terms of power output, but Iserbyt had the better technique. Iserbyt was able to ride through the sandpit properly, lap after lap. On this mogul section, Iserbyt was faster than Van der Haar and Aerts as well. On the off-camber, which had a very awkward ending where you needed to hop off and take some minor steps, and there was some plank there, Iserbyt was also faster. Aerts was more faster, especially on the first muddy part, the running part, and as well as a bit on the climbs. But I think that they were evenly matched because of that, and this parkour had a bit for everyone. But yeah, I think if Aerts doesn't make that mistake, or if he doesn't ride a terrible sandpit in the last lap, I think then Aerts would have been able to win. But I mean, it was weird to see Aerts struggle on the sandpit that much, because usually he's okay in the sand.
Yeah, I think it was a bit weird, and it was not the only time that he struggled in the sand. I think he made that mistake 2-3 times. And Iserbyt last year was not really strong in the sand, and all of a sudden his sand sections were pretty good. The last lap was not good, but he was just kind of lucky that Aerts' sand section was just terrible in a way. But I think Aerts was in some sections very strong. I think stronger than Iserbyt, but like you said, the technique was just a bit on Iserbyt's side. And yeah, I think for Van der Haar and Hermans, I think Hermans was having a very strong beginning part of the race, but after the crash and then when he had to change his bike, it was just not really there anymore. He was kind of out of rhythm. In the end, he came a little bit stronger back and was even able to snatch that third place from Van der Haar. But it was a weird race because there were a lot of mistakes made, and those mistakes influenced the race in the end.
The only thing I can imagine is that Aerts was riding with a bigger tire thread, that he was more plugging himself into the mud, and then had grip in the mud, but the same happens in the sand, and then in the sand you become a tractor and get stuck. Only thing I can imagine, I don't know, or Aerts was just bad in the sand, which is also very possible. But yeah, I think that's really what cost Aerts the win today. In the final lap, the commentators were already saying that Aerts had it in the back after the puncture for Iserbyt, but I was always thinking that Iserbyt could come back in that sand section, and Iserbyt had a very bad sand section in the last lap himself, but Aerts had an even worse one, so Iserbyt could come back, and then we went to the sprint. Twan, what did you think about that sprint, or leading up to the sprint? What happened there?
I think like going into the sprint, Aerts should have pushed on more and like gone for the long sprint, because in principle, if you go into that sprint in second place, you have to go around the outside, and with the turn, it's just a very annoying sprint, to be honest. And like I would personally want to lead, but the moment they go into the sprint, Iserbyt takes the lead, and he does that very well. Can't quite keep the corner, goes out to about the middle of the road. And then when Aerts starts trying to put it alongside him, he moves to the right to close the door, but like leave a fair gap. And he does do that, but when you're Aerts, you don't know how much control Iserbyt has over where he's swinging. So it's really hard to put yourself in that gap. I don't know. I think it's a dirty sprint, but rules-wise, Iserbyt does it by the book, I think.
If we look at the rules, yes, it's allowed what he does. The rules say that you can deviate if you don't endanger another rider. So if you only deviate and don't endanger another rider, you're fine. If you do both, you're not fine. Does he deviate? First part of the rule? Absolutely. He comes from almost the middle of the road and ends up on our left side and his right side of the road. Does he endanger Aerts? No, because he just leaves just enough space that Aerts could have stayed alongside. But as Twan said, if you're in the position of Aerts and you see this happening, what are you going to do? Are you going to risk your entire season by staying alongside when he gives the indication that he's completely going to shut the door? Or do you think, well, it's a Superprestige race, I would love to win, but I'm not going to take the full risks. I get that Aerts backs out. Iserbyt is within the rules, so I understand that they don't DQ him. But yeah, I think it's not the cleanest sprint I have seen.
Yeah, I don't know in what, it's obviously not the cleanest sprint, but you want to win, and I think it's within the book. So when it's within the books, you have the right to do so. So as long as the rules give you the opportunity to do that, you are kind of entitled to be able to do that. And I think Aerts in the end, he didn't feel very bad about the sprint in general. There was no real feud after the race, and I think there's also no need to be having that, because I think overall that the sprint was by the book. It was not the cleanest. It was a bit dirty maybe, but it was definitely within the limits, and that is a bit how cyclocross goes in a way. When you go in a sprint, two guys that are going to be sprinting, it never goes very, very honest. There are always tricks up on the sleeve that you have to try to make sure that you can beat the other guy, and Iserbyt was the smarter guy, and I think also a little bit in the last lap at least the bit stronger.
I mean, if you're Iserbyt and you're going into that sprint, you don't really have anything to lose considering the rules. I mean, that's more the problem I have. Like, sure, the sprint of Iserbyt is allowed in the rules, but in my opinion, this shouldn't be allowed. In the sprint, he looks backwards, he sees Aerts coming and decides to close the door. Why does he have nothing to lose? Well, if he deviates and endangers Aerts and gets DQ'd, he ends second. But he also has a chance. What happens now is if he leaves just enough space, Aerts backs out and he can continue and nothing happens. And he wins. And they leave it. That's what happened now. So he took a shot of winning and he took the win. If he doesn't deviate, I personally think that Aerts would pull alongside. Aerts came pretty close even after he stopped pedaling. And then Iserbyt ends second. So he either chooses between ending second or having a shot at winning but potentially ending second if he violates a rule, but has the same result. And that's more the problem I have. I mean, in this case it wasn't that extreme. If there would be a crash, hopefully there wouldn't have been any severe injuries. But if the speed is higher when it's slightly downhill, or if the deviation is more severe, the same rule goes up, so there aren't really any consequences, because most of the time the UCI only acts when there is a crash. That's my bigger problem I have with this rule, and I would love to see that changed in the future, because in this case it didn't lead to any serious problems, but it could in the future. Let's talk about our third podium sitter now, Quentin Herrmonds. I think Quentin Herrmonds rode an okay race. He said he didn't have his best day, but it was a bit weird to see in the beginning of the race he was good, but after that he faded a bit, especially after he made a bike change. He had 2 laps in which he really struggled.
Quentin Herrmonds, I think he still rode a good race. It's just really toward the end of the race where he started noticing that he was falling off. Had a bit of a crash, of course, as well, which it's been a bit sloppy, I feel like, from Quentin Herrmonds. There have been, I feel like a bit too often, these silly crashes, which you're not really expecting from someone at such a high level in cyclocross. And it's hindering him a little bit, I think. But, I mean, still third place, limiting the damage for the classification, it's not too bad.
I agree. Overall, it was a pretty good race for Hermans, and the same kind of goes for Van der Haar. Van der Haar just unfortunate that Aerts crashes in front of him in the final part of the race, and then he basically ever since that he was out of contention, but before that he made another good impression, especially considering the parcours that we found here. It doesn't really suit Van der Haar. The running in the thick mud, not the easiest for him. So in a way I'm surprised to see him. No, I'm not really surprised to see him in fourth. That's where I would expect him. But I think he could have even done better without that crash of Aerts, because he really had nowhere to go. But then again, that's racing. If he didn't want to be caught up behind the potential crash of someone, he should have been in the lead.
Or done the Quentin Herrmonds and run down the descent. So he was a little bit slower but safer.
Yeah, and the further we got in the race, the less time you lost, because it got trickier and trickier. So yeah, that could have also been a safe option. Final mention of an unlucky rider here, Sweeck, ending 7th here, but that could have well been another rider who would have been in mix for the win. He was catching up after a somewhat slow start, but then he had an issue. He lost his derailleur and needed to run half of the lap. So very unfortunate for Sweeck. It hasn't been the season of Sweeck until now, hasn't it?
It's very telling that today, it's another one where it doesn't quite happen. He was at least in a very solid 5th place, and maybe he could have caught up to the leaders and played a bit of a role, but it just hasn't quite happened for him, and then had to catch up after a long running section, which is, it's very tough, and I think he did well to still get to 7th place.
Yeah, next weekend Coxside should be something for him. Let's look at our entire top 10 then. We had, of course, that win of Iserbyt in front of Aerts and Hermans. 4th place was for Lars van der Haar ahead of Jens Adams, Toon van der Bos. Then we find Sweeck in 7th. 8th place was for Daan Soete, who had a solid race. 9th place for Kevin Kuhn, and Niels van der Putte is our first under 23 rider who rounds off the top 10. Let's mention Jens Adams here. Issam, the 5th place is very good for him, isn't it?
Yeah, it definitely was, and I have to say, when the race was going on, I didn't really expect him to be able to in the end bring that 5th place home, but the longer the race was going on, the better he seemed to look, and overall I think he can be very happy with 5th place. Obviously Sweeck should have been 5th, or at least within the top 5, but that doesn't do anything to the performance of Adams, because it was a very solid race yet again.
I think here a little shout out to the director as well of the race, as we were able to catch the whole fight at the front, but we were also able to see the guys in 5th, 6th, 7th places, etc. We were also able to see them quite a lot, which was fun to see for once as well. So that was really nice, and Jens Adams taking maximum profit off of that.
Definitely good to see for the rider who rides for the privateer team of the Hollebeek Hoeve. Good to see him up there, and I mean the same basically goes for Toon van der Bos. Another solid performance by him. They were for a while in a battle with Kevin Kuhn and Ryan Kamp, but those two riders exploded at the end of the race and still got overtaken by Sweeck and Soete. And for Ryan Kamp, also Van der Putte and Meelse passed him.
Yeah, a bit of a shame, I think. In my opinion, the top 10 was definitely doable, possible. But then just to be not able to finish within the top 10 is just a bit of a shame, and it's a tendency. Yeah, we see it a little bit more. But to be honest, today there was not really a very fast start or anything. It was he kind of came on his position very fast in the race, and I guess he should have just stayed in that position. But for some reason it was just not there, and in the end of the race it was just lights out, and he was not able to finish within the top 10.
For Kuhn, it is his first top 10 in a big race. Yeah, he did win the Radcross in Ilmenau as his first race of the season, but before that he collected, I think, 2 11th places and the 13th or 14th one. Don't correct me on that one, but his first top 10 here in Belgium, good to see. Form is improving for him, and I'm personally glad to see that, because this is at least one foreign flag we see in the top 10, and I can't stress how important that is. If you want to hear more on that, we should advise you to listen to our Tower preview podcast with Peter Dlasky. He gave us an interesting insight on that one. Let's take a look at the women's race then. Twan, it was a pretty interesting one there as well. Tell us what happened there.
It was a very strong start by Annemarie Worst, who was able to take maximum advantage of it with the tricky start if you are a bit further back, as Brandt would get called out a little bit. She and Betsma would ride a catch-up race, as they would eventually catch up with Annemarie Worst. Denise Betsma did struggle and would drop a little bit earlier, as Brandt would put the pressure on after a pit from Annemarie Worst, and on the weird mogul bump section she made a fatal flaw which cost her any chance of challenging Brandt later in the lap for the victory, and it was the world champion that was able to take it home ahead of Worst and Betsma.
Let's talk about that race a bit. I have to say, I am very surprised how good Annemarie Worst was here today. I mean, we talked about her at the European Championships, that we were kind of doubting her because there was this weird story, and today there was still stories of a lingering back injury, but she was very strong, especially on the technical sections. In pure power output, without a doubt, Brandt was the best, and probably Worst also was a bit worse than that than Betsma, and maybe even Kastelein, but the technique I saw from Worst today on that mogul section, on the hills, on the off-cambers, it was really good, and unfortunately she crashed twice in the race, which I think the last crash didn't cost her the win. Without that, Brandt would have won, but if you look at the total picture in the beginning of the race, she opens a big gap. If she doesn't crash there, well, I just need to see if the others are able to close that gap.
Yeah, correct. I think that it was a bit of a shame, because if she had indeed that gap, it could have been a totally different race, especially because then you're not the one that is that has to chase. You have the initiative, you can make a mistake and then they can come back, so you don't really spill extra energy in a way. But it just feels like they just miscalculated her shape, that it's just now coming a little bit into play, that she's getting in better shape, because the confidence they had in Koppenberg that she would be able to be fighting for the podium, which then just didn't happen. It was just not there. And also, you know, it is coming, and I have a feeling that we will hear more from Worst, especially going in the later part of the season, and that she will be able to have more consistent races on the podium.
She did also mention in the interview after that, even last week, her back was still playing up, like halfway through the cross, like she would start feeling it. And that this week it finally felt good all race. So, of course, she's hoping that continues. So that is a promising sign.
Yeah, about Worst, there have been so many stories. First, it was she was training for the European Championships. We have also heard that she had a knee injury. Now it's her back injury. So it's a bit of uncertainty around her, and I think, sure, I believe that there is an issue with her. We can see it in her results. We saw some things last year in her results as well that they weren't there. So perhaps it's a long-term thing, but I would just like to have clarity on it, because it doesn't help, and the same also goes for Alvarado. I mean, we've heard that she had problems this summer, and without a doubt there have been problems, but if we don't know them, I don't know how I should factor them. I mean, everybody has some problems, but I think for Alvarado it's been a big problem, and I would like to know what that is, and the same for Manon Bakker, because I've heard rumors there. But like for Worst, there's at least some clarity. She says like multiple things that contradict each other from time to time, but for Bakker I've only heard unofficial rumors, so I think it's just something I would like to see a bit more clarity around it, because otherwise for us it's very difficult to have a fair judgment on it. I hope for the rest of the season we can see her come back and fight with Brandt more often, about Worst that is. But today we saw Brandt come back after, I think it was some kind of issue in the beginning of the race. I'm not too sure what that was exactly.
She failed to clip into her pedal, I think.
I think it was something with her saddle, at least that's what Sven Nys said on the Sporza broadcast.
I think that was later in the race, right?
Anyway, she had issues. Let's keep it to that. Probably both. And regardless of that, then still winning, despite, and 18 seconds is maybe a bit of a picture that was created because the crash of Worst, but even winning, despite being, I think it was 25 seconds down at some point in the first lap, still good, and just shows Brandt is back.
It shows indeed, and it is just that start that still doesn't want to come out. But after that, there is no one that really can stop her on the parcours, which is on some sections very fast. She was still able to make the difference. And just to come back on her first lap, it was indeed she had something with her pedal, and then the saddle came later on in the race in the first lap as well. So it was a terrible first lap in general. Not even that she could do too much about that. And obviously in Niel, it's very crucial to be in the front when you have the first lap, because there's a lot of traffic jam almost going in the first couple of corners and the hills. But I think Brandt is having the mojo, the momentum, and this is definitely going to be someone that we're going to see win more races going in the future.
Definitely in Tabor already, perfect parcours for her, so I expect to see her there again. And today we saw it again. And if we then look at Betsema, who ended third, do you guys think that is just a sign that she mistimed her peak and peaked a bit too early, and that she's now a bit tired or not fresh enough, or was there something else in today's race?
I mean, she was in the interview, at least she was not really happy with the race. She was feeling that she didn't have the legs to be able to fight for victory. The gap was also there between her and Brandt on the fast parcours. I mean, it was 30 seconds. It's very hard to go on time, but in general, just looked a little bit. It didn't look that sharp as it was before the European Championship. So maybe the European Championship she had not the best legs, and then the pressure was also there. And now it was just not having the best legs. So I think that overall the shape is just a bit poorly timed. That she was just not in time to be at her best. But she still has 2 chances to be at her best, and that's the National Championships to have a jersey, or the World Championships.
Yeah, we also spoke about that in our preview for the Tabor podcast, that she is targeting the championships now. So in a way, that will decide her season. I think that the third place here is still solid and consistent, as we've seen throughout the entire season. And I mean, it's not necessarily very good, but it's also not very bad. A solid, consistent performance like we're used to from Betsema. Let's run down our entire top 10. We had 6 Dutch women in the first 6 places. It was Brandt ahead of Worst, Betsema, Kastelein, Alvarado, and then Bakker, who I already said had a better race. 7th place for Ribeirol ahead of Anna Kay. 9th place Clara Hunsinger, and 10th Inge van der Heijden. I'd like to firstly address the 4th place here of Jara Kastelein. Another solid performance by her. A bit of improvement is to be seen at her in terms of results as well throughout the past couple of weeks. Not around that 9th place anymore, but now consistently around the top 5 where I would expect her. What's your thought on her races, Sam?
Yeah, I think in the beginning we saw Kastelein, be at the front, be there, closing the gaps, and then just later on she came a little bit on her place, and then the gaps started to grow a little bit. To be honest, not really a parcours for her. It's very technical in a way in some sections, and mistakes are made quite easily. Kastelein is in terms of technique not the strongest. She has a good shape, but it's just not good enough to be able to bring up the fight. But I think overall, a very, very solid result, and also important for the points.
Yeah, that technical section on the moguls, she lost like 10 seconds a lap there, especially the laps that she started running. I mean, it just shows that she still doesn't really have the technique, but in a way it's better than last year, but still not good enough. However, we should also talk about the riders at the back end of the top 10. I think a very good result that we saw here today from Ribeirol, 7th, is probably not in terms of result, but in terms of competitions versus result, her best result of the season.
Yeah, I think for Ribeirol, very, very strong performance. Finally, we saw her a little bit more at the front of the race in the top 10, but I was also very impressed by Anna Kay, to be honest, because she had to come back from an injury. I don't specifically know what injury it was, but I think it was after a crash. And then to be able to come back after a pretty solid time out, and then to get a top 10 position, and it seemed to look very well. Obviously, I think she lacks a little bit of base, but I'm very happy that she's able to get in the mix. And there's still a lot of races to go where she can be able to even fight for the top 5. Who knows?
It's indeed very promising to see her to be able to do 8th on her return to racing. Clearly got some decent training in, and it's still gonna go well. And I hope for good things the rest of the season.
I can confirm that Anna Kay has been doing a lot of work to recover from that, but the recovery didn't go flawless. There were some hiccups that she came onto. She had an artificial ligament put onto the place where she broke her bone, so she needed to wait until a new one formed over the top of that. So she couldn't really do a lot of training due to that, but she did a lot of training off the bike. And now she's finally back a bit ahead of schedule. She hoped to be returning the week after Tabor, but it's a good sign, and I expect improvements for her. She's also not racing Tabor, so I assume she will be racing Leuven, and probably most riders will be skipping Leuven. So I think in Leuven she can get a podium, and depending on who starts, maybe already a win. In 9th place, we saw Clara Hunsinger today. It's a pretty disappointing result for her, but I'm going to be honest, this is a very anti-Clara Hunsinger parcours. The start is super important. Well, we know that Clara doesn't usually have the best starts. She is working on it, but she's just a slow starter. She needs time to warm up. So it's not something for her. Also, the technical sections, the running sections, it's not something where she can really use her power. So in a way, 9th is still a bit below what I expected. But yeah, I didn't expect her to be competing for a podium here. However, her teammate Katie Close, this is her first race over here in Europe of the season, just 20 years old, had a very rapid start and 16th. I mean, sure, it's not a place where you say, oh, this is super promising, but I mean, if I'm looking at foreign riders and I see them come 16th in their first race here over in Europe, as we heard in our interview with Katie Keogh, it doesn't compare. We've seen it in the USCX series. Racing in Europe and the USA are two completely different things. It needs time to adapt. You have jet lag, and she only arrived here a couple of days ago. So in my opinion, to end 16th then is definitely not a shame.
Yeah, it's just something you can build on and move forward towards. Just a decent way to start the European campaign.
Yeah, especially considering her age, as I said, just 20 years old. I'm looking forward to see her at the Under-23 World Championships because, I mean, of course, there's still a couple of riders not here, but, I mean, Vash and Pietersen, or especially Vash, she will probably race with the elite, so if she could get a top 10 there, it's definitely promising, and, I mean, she did end ahead of Josie Nelson, who finished 10th at the European Championships, so in a way, that's also something that's promising for her, and Josie Nelson, also not a bad race by her to end 17th. But then I think we've covered it for this episode of the Cyclocross Social Podcast about the Superprestige in Niel. Twan and Isan, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for hosting.
And we will be back this weekend with more about the racing, certainly for the World Cup in Tabor on Sunday. So I'll catch you guys then. If you enjoyed it, make sure to leave a rating and share it with your cyclocross friends, and we will catch you this weekend. Goodbye.